All right, today I'm going to go through the process that I use to make an Avenger style holster. So whenever we're finished, first to begin with, I just use a simple manila folder for all of my templates. They work really well, sturdy, so they hold up a little bit over time, better than paper. So when we finish, we're going to wind up with something like this, which is just going to be what you're going to use to trace your pattern onto the leather to cut out and actually make your holster. So we're going to have two pieces. The first is the holster itself, and the second is the support piece, and the back loop, which is all one piece. So you have to decide several things in terms of design and what you like, in terms of the angle of the weapon, that it rides on your belt, whether you want a sweat shield or not, which is the piece that goes up along the back side of the weapon. Typically, I prefer not to have them, but I know a lot of people do like them. So if I'm making holsters for other people and I'm gonna use the same template, I simply take that piece and I fold it down so it gives a clean line whenever I trace over my pattern. So to begin with, we're gonna select our weapon. Today I'm gonna be using a Sig Sauer P225, which is probably one of my favorite weapons. You do need a weapon or at least a blue gun. You can see that this one's I set up with a piece on the top for the sight channel so the weapon draws clear, which is always a good tip. This is not a gun safety course, but of course we're going to make sure that the weapon is cleared and empty and safe. So if you're making a holster, you're not familiar with weapons, and find someone that is, or preferably use a blue gun. So do always make sure of that. So to start with, pretty simple. It's got a fold line here in the crease, you can see. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start, and we're gonna line up the sight post, which is the front here, in the middle of our rear post on our actual line or crease in the holster. So this way we're sure that the weapon is gonna be centered in the holster. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to lay this out and trace the weapon on one side only, because the other side will be an exact copy, and then we're going to draw our pattern around the weapon. Some of that I just kind of freehand in terms of what you think you like in terms of design, but we'll go over a couple of those things real quick. So once the weapon is centered, it is literally just laying the weapon down, making sure that it stays in the position. Then we're going to come and we're going to trace the weapon. Now, obviously we're not making a holster to cover the entire weapon, but I do like to trace the details of the weapon whenever we're doing this, simply so I have an idea of where things are going to be, where the retention is going to be. So you can see here I'm going to mark for the chamber as we come down the barrel, and I'm going to mark for my front sight. And we're going to come all the way around. It's important that you're holding the pencil obviously close to the gun. So nothing in this is an exact science. You know, this is just a quick, easy process. It does take some trial and error. Sometimes I might make, 3 or 4 templates before I actually have one that I'm happy with. I do always trace the trigger. It's important to know where that is in your design. I always strongly recommend that any holster that you make does cover the trigger, if not the entire trigger guard. But some things we'll take into consideration for those that aren't used to carrying a weapon or may not think about the design elements in a holster, is you do want to make sure that you have some clearance between the holster and the grip. So that way when you go to grab the weapon, you're able to get a good grip on it and draw the weapon cleanly. Last thing you want to do is try to wedge your finger in behind the leather to try to get the weapon out. So you can see here we have just a quick tracing of the gun. It's pretty simple. So then when we go to actually make the weapon, or make the holster rather, we're just going to fold it in half and we're going to wind up with our two-sided pattern. So the next step that we're going to do is we need to figure out how far off of the actual drawing of the weapon our stitch line is going to be. I always do this as the next step, simply because if you go in and you draw where your holster is, you might come in too close to the gun and not have enough clearance for your stitches. So the stitch line should be half the width of the weapon plus 1/8 inch. So that should give you enough clearance. So, because if you remember, we're going to have enough leather to actually wrap around the width of the weapon, because this is obviously paper thin. So we'll measure this weapon very quickly. And let's see, we're awfully thin here. From side to side, it looks like it's 1 inch wide, which you'll find probably most handguns are going to be in that kind of a range. So we're going to take I just use a simple compass. I did have one with a pencil attachment that I can't seem to find anymore, but this works just as well. So you can see here we're going to be, I don't know, not 1 1/8. We're going to take a half. We're going to take half of it and add an 1/8. All right, and that gets us about there. Again, not an exact science. You do want to get your stitch line pretty close to the weapon, especially if it's a holster you're going to mold. If you're not going to mold the weapon, we might want to come a little bit further out. But we're just going to take. I'm just going to scratch a line in here as I trace around. And again, this isn't an exact stitch. This isn't where our stitch line is going to be. This is just giving us a guideline for about where we think it's going to wind up. We're going to maneuver it around a little bit here in just a bit. Oops, we're off the line. So obviously we're going to have an intersect there. I see a lot of holsters where they're making and they're leaving a piece below the weapon down here, or they might sew that in closed. You want the holster to be as minimal as possible. It adds weight, it adds bulk. The bigger it is, the more comfortable it is to carry. Just so you guys can, I can see this line, but I'm sure we can't in the video. So we're just gonna kind of trace where that line's gonna be. But I also recommend leaving the end of the holster open. I'm typically not going to sew down through here. Also, I don't need it to come all the way in to close. You want a good idea to leave it open simply because the dust and things can collect in the bottom of a holster. So this just lets any dust fall through, less likely to scratch the weapon, improves the life and the length of the holster. So I do want to wrap around just slightly on the holster. So I'm probably going to back that up to, let's just say, a little less than half. So I'm just going to come off where the end of the weapon would be to give me an idea of where I would like that holster to end. So we're just going to call it right there. Again, I don't do anything that's really that precise. I don't have any special computer or drawing tools to make these holes, to make patterns. It's just you certainly can. There's nothing wrong with it, but simple. This is something anybody can do, and everybody's got at home to do that. So the next thing that we're going to have to decide is where we're going to put our trailing belt loop. So in here, this is where you're going to come in and look at what kind of grip angle and things that you're thinking about. It's good to have a spare belt around, or at least a scrap piece of leather. This is 1 1/4 inch that I use for belts. My square here measures 1.5 inches, so I oftentimes will just kind of use it as a guide. But you want to make sure that you use something of the same width so that you're sure that when you cut the holes, or your belt loops rather, that it fits. Now, you can do some precise measurements and get your angles right. If you just have an idea of the angle or the cant of how you like to carry the weapon, whether you're straight up and down, more often than not, a typical angle of the weapon is going to be, somewhere between, somewhere right around there, so that the weapon draws more forward, and it doesn't sit as low on your hip, just to give you more comfortable way to carry the gun. This is typically, what they might call like an FBI cant, which I think they were the first to make the holsters to carry that way. So again, there is nothing scientific about it at all. You also are going to need to decide kind of where you like to carry the gun, whether if you're going to carry the gun very low on a belt, or if you want to carry the weapon very high. I tend to try to figure out where I think about, the center of the weight is going to be, just so it's distributed. But typically that's going to come somewhere around the trigger. So if this is kind of the angle that I feel that I might like to carry the gun at, so there, if we'll square it up so you can see it squared up. So and I might be a little bit high there. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. And so this is going to be this style of holster I like because it does ride really close to the body, and holds very tight. It's very secure. There's tons of different holster designs out there, and you can kind of play around with what you like. So what I've just drawn here is I've just kind of traced where my imaginary belt is going to be, so that I'm sure that whenever I come across, I'm going to be able to hit the loops. We're also going to need to account for your back support piece, because you will need to make sure that you have enough room on the top back side of the holster to do your stitching, to stitch around and still make sure that you have clearance for the belt. If you or whoever you're making the holster for wears a real gun belt, which I strongly recommend, we might do a video about making those one day. You need to account for extra thickness, because also those belts tend to be much thicker. For mine, I'm usually using a 8 to 9 ounce shoulder with a somewhere between right around a 3 ounce liner. So overall, you're looking 11 to 12 ounces total leather. So that's awfully thick belt to support the weight of the weapon. So you need kind of make some adjustments there. If you're just making a general holster, or something maybe you're going to sell or whatever, I would err on the side of the larger belt, just because most people should have a gun belt if they're carrying a weapon. So when we come through, when we look at the trailing arm here, or the trailing loop rather, we do need to make sure again that we have enough clearance for stitches to come around. I normally like to sew both sides of this. I sew on a machine, but I'm going to show you how to set this up for sewing by hand. So the closer that this loop is to the weapon, the tighter it's going to hold to the gun, and the tighter and more securely to hold the weapon, because of the way that the leather is going to stretch around it. So this is roughly where my stitch line is going to be. If you're going to do a double stitch line, you should account for whatever spacing that you're going to have on that, to have them separate. So we'll just assume that you're going to do 2, which, to be quite honest, is for aesthetics only. Any holster that's hand sewn, especially, but even machine sewn, you're not going to break the stitches. So the second stitch line really just makes them look pretty, but it also does add a lot more sewing. So take that into consideration whenever you think about the time and effort that you want to spend on the holster. Is it worth, you know, doubling your stitching simply for the appearance or look of the weapon? All right, so this is where we're at here. I do recommend it squared so that you're square on the belt. And let's see, so again, no exact sciences here, but that right there should give me enough room between my two stitch lines to fit another stitch line, and it fits awfully close. So we're just gonna kind of mark that in here. Okay, so from there we'll need to set up our width or diameter of the belt, and it could be as simple as just taking it, especially if you have the belt you're going to wear it on. It's just take your calipers, adjust them down to the belt, and then I would back it up a little. So you're going to have just a little extra room there, you can see, so that we make sure the belt slides through easily. This will probably draw up a little bit as if you're going to mold the holster, which in this design I'm setting it up to do that. So we're going to come off about right there. Okay, again, I'm just going to trace this just so we can see it on the camera of where we're at. In here, you're probably, you might have a punch for this. If you have a punch set up for belt loops already, I don't. I find it's just as easy to cut them, especially if unless you're making just a ton of holsters. Just go ahead and use your punch. You know, you can punch through a manila folder a lot easier than you could a piece of leather. So this is kind of what I've got set up right there. Same kind of thing. I might follow up and just figure out, you know, how far off I want that stitch line to be. You know, if you're looking for consistency, I might match it to, if you're going to do the double stitch line, to there. And again, we're just going to kind of come around. And you can see we're going to come right up to it right there. So that's going to give us plenty of room. May not have to be that far off of it. This is actually the reason I got into leatherwork, because I was buying lots of guns, and you go and you spend money for a weapon, and then you got to go blow $60 to $100 on a halfway decent holster, and you wind up with all these holsters that you don't like, you know, in search of the perfect one. Sometimes it's just easier if you just design it and make it yourself. I like to do things myself, but that's kind of what got me even started remotely in leather work. And I actually started out making K-Dex holsters, which were pretty simple. Strongly recommend press, otherwise you do a lot of standing on your weapon. So anyway, so that gets me, this is really just set up, not necessarily that it's going to be my exact stitch line. When I go to set that up, I'm actually going to lay that out on the leather, just like you normally would do with any other project. You know, I just normally will use my, I don't have it on my desk, on my counter here, but I normally just use my stitch groover to set my spacing off of the hole that we make. So when we come in and we're going to draw the holster, we know this is where the belt is, so we know that we're going to have to be higher than the belt. But again, I normally just kind of freehand some of this in terms of the design of what I like and what I don't like. You may want your holster to come up higher on one side than the other, which is fine. So a little bit different process if you're not looking for it symmetrical. What I would do simply is you want to transfer the tracing of your gun to the other side. Lots of ways to do that. We can take the weapon, if you put it back on the center line, lined up, flip it over, trace it, If you want to be more precise in where that measurement is, you can simply just come in and poke holes. You know, this is just my stitching awl here, and it'll come through on the other side and give you a good idea of where that line is. For this purpose here, just to make things simple, I'm just going to make it symmetrical. So I know this is my trigger here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of come in, and I want to leave some room between the belt and the grip of the weapon, but I want to make sure that we're going to cover that trigger. So what I would typically do is kind of come in lower here, and then come back up. And again, this is a lot of trial and error. You'll figure out what's going to kind of work for you and what's not. I'm gonna generally come up the weapon some once I get to where the top of the trigger is. So that's the bottom of the frame of the weapon and the top of the trigger. So once we reach that part, we've cleared the handle, so you could even come up once you get to where the grip is going to be, if you like, and come up. You might take into consideration the design elements of the weapon. If I'm getting real detailed about it, I might actually take the grip off and lay the grip on so that I can kind of follow the line of the grip. But again, it's just however much detail and effort you're trying to put into it here. All right, so that's probably enough room to get a square stitched in for the back part of the loop. Do keep in mind we are going to make this piece wrap around to the front, which I know I didn't really discuss very much, but that is for the rigidity of the holster and to make sure the holster doesn't collapse once the gun is drawn. Especially, this is very, very critical if it's an inside the waistband holster. You want to make sure that that you can reholster the weapon once you're done firing it. All right, and we're just going to come same thing here again. Nothing here is all that precise with how I do it. It may not be your taste, and that's fine as well. Clearly, we do not want to come all the way up to where that stitch line would be, especially if you're doing a double stitch or two stitch lines. Just be aware of where those lines are. All right, so pretty straightforward in terms of how that goes. The next part of what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in and I'm going to cut this out, and then we'll start on making the second section there. I'm going to go and pause the video because cutting this can take some time. I'm sure everybody knows how to cut. You're just going to use a scissors or utility knife or whatever you have that you have lying around that you like to use. So I'm going to pause the video and I will post the follow-up to how I'm going to make my back strap and support piece in the comments of this video. Okay, thank you very much.